Thank you all for joining us for today's Wednesday webinar at noon. The topic that I'm talking about today is about ICPSR and specifically about depositing your research data in ICPSR. So let me share my screen to you and we'll get started. Now, I always find the switch over to a slideshow through Zoom a little confusing, but let's get this going. Okay. So, depositing your research data.
Kathleen, just real quick, you are still in the mode where we can see your slide and your next slide. You're not in the presentation mode.
Okay, let me see if I can get you over to the right place. Okay, right screen this time?
Yep, there you go.
Okay, good. All right, some background on ICPSR. That stands, of course, for Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Science Research. And it was founded in the early 1960s at University of Michigan's Institute for Social Research and still stays very closely associated with Michigan. The original purpose of it was to archive and disseminate data from the American National Election Studies. And it is still a great place to go if you want to look at any data about elections. It started off with 25 member institutions in the early 60s and has now grown probably now to about 800 universities, foundations, government institutions, and nonprofits. The data archives still focus primarily in the social and behavioral sciences, but they've really expanded far beyond that. They now host about 21 specialized collections of data in education, aging, criminal justice, substance abuse, terrorism, and many other fields. Many of the thematic collections actually serve as the data repository for different government agencies. So in ICPSR, you'll find the National Archive of Criminal Justice Data and the National Archive of Data on Arts and Culture, just to give you an idea of the breadth of the subject areas it spans. Now, the role of ICPSR, along with other data repositories, has become more and more critical in recent years. Starting in 2013, the Office of Science and Technology Policy put out a memo that directed federal agencies with large research and development expenditures to create plans that would make digital scientific data funded by federal agencies available to the public. NIH has probably taken the largest steps on that, and effective just this past January, their data sharing policy now requires that all new and competing proposals or renewals that generate any kind of scientific data, regardless of what the level of the funding is, must include a detailed plan for how the data will be managed and shared during the entire funded period. So this, of course, has created a considerable burden on researchers to seek out appropriate repositories to store their data and information about how to plan for that data storage and sharing. So data sharing is important, obviously, because of these federal mandates, but also because it's just the right thing to do. Data sharing reinforces open scientific inquiry. It encourages diversity of analysis and opinions. It promotes new research and allows for testing of new and alternative methods. The scrutiny of shared data sets allows the improvement of methods of data collection and measurement. It reduces costs by avoiding duplicate data collection efforts. You know, why should grant funds be used to recollect data that's already available from another source? And it provides an important resource for training in research. And that's certainly something that I see all the time, that I constantly have students coming to me looking for data sets that they can work with. So deposit options with ICPSR. Very briefly, there's 3 different options available. One is Open ICPSR, which is basically a self-deposit mechanism quickly available for replication data sets. Or data can actually be donated to the ICPSR member archive. Or researchers can pay for the full ICPSR curation services. And that's probably the level that most researchers who are looking at using ICPSR are going to be interested in looking at. So a little bit more about each of those options. The Open ICPSR option is basically a self-publishing repository. It's well suited for replication data sets, for researchers who need to publish their raw data, especially if they need to get it published quickly in association with a journal article. It supplies up to 2 gigabytes of storage space. It allows for immediate publication with a fixed data citation and a persistent identifier. In other words, a DOI, a document identifier, is automatically provided. And it does meet funder requirements for shared data. What's important to note, though, is that ICPSR doesn't improve or alter the data sets in any way. They're basically preserved as is and distributed in the same condition and format as submitted by the depositor. So investigators who are submitting data to Open ICPSR are completely responsible for ensuring the confidentiality of research subjects. So if there's any identifiable or sensitive information, that has to be indicated during the submission process. And if so, then the data collection is published as restricted access. Now, ICPSR does occasionally actually choose open ICPSR data collections that they would consider of particular interest and within their scope, their collection scope, to actually put through the curation process and add to their general archives. Now, donating data to the ICPSR member archive is possible if data meets the ICPSR collection development policies. Data is processed, basically, you get in line with all of the other member-funded data collections. The extent of the processing is determined by the attributes of the data and the documentation. And this is an important consideration. The data is made available to ICPSR member institutions at no cost, but individuals at non-member institutions who want to access that data would have to pay a $500 fee. So this actually does not necessarily meet some of the funder stipulations for making data openly available. The full package, and again, this is primarily what researchers would be likely to use ICPSR for. The full package includes full paid curation of the data for a one-time fee. Now, the best estimates that I've been able to get on that are somewhere between $3,000 and $8,000. So this is the avenue that's generally preferred for funded research, with the expectation that those curation fees are included in grant application budgets. And the key factor is that it ensures that the data will be fully available to the general public as funding agencies require. Now, what's included in the curation process? What does that $3,000 to $8,000 pay for? Data enhancement is part of it. The data managers at ICPSR will review and enhance both the data itself and the technical documentation to make them as readily usable as possible and compliant with disclosure standards. They provide for long-term preservations. Those of us who have worked in, fields that even touch on the technical world for any length of time know that the projected age span of any given technology usually tops out at about 10 years. So for long-term preservation of data, it needs to take into account the changing technologies that will sometimes require that the data be converted into different formats. And basically just that measures be taken to ensure that the data is not decaying, to make sure that it continues to be usable. A big part of the curation process is protection of confidentiality. And this is where the ICPSR specialization in social and behavioral data really comes in. Because of the focus in those fields, there is considerable background in dealing with sensitive data, data that includes human subjects and sensitive areas. So the ICPSR curation process removes personal identifiers and protects the confidentiality of research participants. ICPSR also has mechanisms in place to safeguard sensitive data through varying levels of access, including restrictive use data and secure data enclaves. And finally, one of the things that ICPSR provides as part of the curation process is that it tracks how often data sets are downloaded or accessed. So a little bit more about that protection of confidentiality for research subjects. Again, there's a detailed review of data sets to assess the disclosure risk. That might include modifying data if necessary to protect respondents' confidentiality. It might also include limiting access to data sets for which modifying the data would substantially limit the utility, or for which the risk of disclosure remains unacceptably high. It also includes training of staff and consulting with data producers in methods of risk assessment and mitigation for disclosure of potentially identifiable information. For very sensitive data, as I mentioned, ICPSR actually has several restricted use levels that protect confidentiality. The first is secure downloads, where the researcher, rather than just being able to download data directly from the ICPSR website, has to request the data through an online application and is given a secure link to download the encrypted data. The next level up is what they call a virtual data enclave. Basically, it provides restricted use data via a virtual machine. So the researcher is working on their own computer, but operating on a remote server that acts as a virtual protected data environment. And then the third and most restricted is a physical data enclave, often referred to as the Bat Cave. This is where data is so sensitive that it is only accessible for on-site access in one of the buildings in Ann Arbor. And for example, a lot of the data that is restricted to that physical data enclave is dealing with prison inmates, victims of violence, or serious criminal offenders. So, what kind of data can be deposited in ICPSR? Most of the data, of course, is quantitative. And options for those data formats might include raw ASCII formats, generally provided with the setup files that would allow them to be read into standard statistical programs. the data might be in the form of system files within specific analysis programs, or portable files created by those statistical programs. But data might also include qualitative data, interview transcripts, for example, geospatial data, and I'm watching Steve's head perk up on that one, audio files, video files. And again, curation staff will work with investigators to anonymize that data wherever possible. Obviously, this is considerably more challenging with audio or video files than it might be for quantitative data. So when should I start thinking about how to share my data? As you can see, going back to the new NIH mandates, this is something that you should be thinking about right from the start. Your data management plan now actually may be required to be part of your initial project proposal, both in terms of how you propose to store your data through the research process, but also where you eventually plan to deposit the data, which of course also involves having some information about how that's going to be financed, which again is one of the reasons for reaching out to ICPSR when you're in the planning stage to get some estimate of what the eventual costs might be. And through the data life cycle, what are some of the ways to make sure that you're following best practices? Well, ICPSR actually has an excellent guide to data preparation and archiving that you can download directly from their website. And again, just like reaching out and getting in touch with them early on in your research planning process, grab yourself a copy of their data management guide. It has excellent information from everything on file naming conventions, how to make sure that you're backing up your data properly, how to make sure that you're sharing access with appropriate people, and then moving on to the curation and deposit process. Now, this is something that I'm very happy to share. We actually do have confirmation of a Drexel data set deposited in ICPSR. This is from the lead study, the Diabetes Location, Environmental Attributes, and Disparities study. And it was deposited using their full curation services. So let me switch over and find the right screen for you. Let me see if I could just pull this up. There we go. Here is our Drexel data deposit. These are measures of community characterizations and of neighborhood social and economic environment scores. And this is one of the valuable features that ICPSR provides. It shows us that this data has had 45 downloads Now it's saying the past 3 years, but it hasn't been there that long. I think the data was just deposited back in March. And it provides a bibliography of publications that have used this data. And the only one listed so far is actually part of this study itself, but we certainly expect that there will be different additional citations added to this in the future. So we can all cheer for Drexel's first ICPSR data deposit. So if you need assistance with data management, or you have questions about depositing your data in ICPSR, you can reach out to our data management service, datamanagement@drexel.edu. Contact your subject librarian, or you can contact me, khturner@drexel.edu. So, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
So Kathleen, there are a couple already in chat. If you want, I will read those off to you.
I am opening them up. Restrictions in the type of data you can deposit. I don't think there are restrictions. As it noted, the storage space is limited. 2 gigabytes sounds like a lot, but it's not anymore if you're talking about video data. So anything that's going to go beyond the 2 gigabytes wouldn't be eligible for that deposit. There is, of course, also the concern that it doesn't provide any mechanisms for securing sensitive data in any way. So if there are human subjects involved in your research, this is probably not the most appropriate mechanism. And the data enhancement services, I believe they do some data cleaning, but they definitely provide additional metadata services. One of the things that makes ICPSR a very powerful and useful repository is that they have very strong metadata standards. So any data that goes through their full curation process also has very thorough metadata provided that allows easier discovery of the data.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Any other questions?
Does the 2 gigabyte limit just apply to the open ICPSR?
Yes. I can't even begin to imagine the size of some of the data in some of the other full deposit data sets. And of course, what I didn't mention is that you can access ICPSR through the Drexel Libraries list of databases. Just look under I for ICPSR. It's also featured on a lot of our library guides, including, of course, the public health guide and our data management guides. And we recommend that the first thing that you do, if you are going to use ICPSR for any purposes, is set up your own login. It will greatly enhance the features that are available to you. Janice, did you have another question?
I did. So the range, and I know sometimes it's hard to find out what things cost in ICPSR, but the range is pretty broad, and the 3,000 to 8,000. And so I was wondering what determine like what end your cost might be at. Is it more like the size of the data or the type of data, or?
The best answer that I've been able to get from them, and as you noted, even getting that range has been a little difficult. Obviously, size of data is going to matter, but I believe that the type of data, both in terms of format, which would influence how much curation it's going to need in the future to make sure that it continues to be available, and particularly how much work is the data going to need to ensure confidentiality. Those are probably the factors that are really going to determine the cost of the curation services.
That makes sense.
So my suspicions are that data that's probably geographic with little chance of identifying individual subjects, or data that's primarily quantitative, is probably going to have a lower curation cost than, for example, audio or visual files that will both be a more difficult format to work with and also require considerable more work to ensure that human subjects are thoroughly protected.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Any further questions? All right, I thank you all for joining us. And as usual, within a couple of days, we will be putting this video up on our YouTube channel, where you can see the video recordings of all of our past Wednesday webinars. All right, I thank you for joining us today.